Hello, and welcome to this Pali Studies tutorial. If you've been following, you'll know that this is one in a series of tutorials about pronouns in the Pali language. And finally, we're approaching the end of our list. And in this video, we'll be looking at the relative pronoun and also relative clauses. So, okay, what's a relative pronoun? Well, a relative pronoun is one which begins a relative clause. And a relative clause is one which gives us more information about a preceding noun. For instance, this is the house that Jack built. Relative pronouns in English are words like who or whom, which, that, whose, where, or when. Now these should look familiar as we've seen them before. The words beginning wh we've seen used as interrogative pronouns and that as a demonstrative pronoun. But in English, these words can also be used in other ways. And today we're going to look at how they're used in relative clauses. So let's quickly look at some examples to get an idea of what a relative clause is. Do you know the boy who started last week? Here we can see the clause who started last week is referring to the boy. It's identifying and giving us more information about which boy we're talking about. My teacher is a person whom I like very much. Can I have the plate that I gave you? Notice that each relative clause starts with a relative pronoun. This is the dog which bit me. I like the girl whose party it was. I want to live somewhere where there are trees. Yesterday was the day when I quit. In each of these examples, the relative clause begins with a relative pronoun and provides more information about a preceding noun in the sentence. So now might be a good time to look at the difference between words, phrases, and clauses. I doubt you'll be surprised to learn that words are the smallest units of a sentence. We've seen previously that we can classify them by what they represent. That is, nouns represent people, places, things or ideas, and verbs represent actions or states of being. And words can be put together to make a phrase. For instance, an adjective can be added to a noun to make a noun phrase. That is, a group of words which act as a single unit, or in this case, as a noun would, acting as a subject or object of a verb. Likewise, we can add auxiliaries or adverbs to a verb to make a verb phrase. So we can see that phrases can be classed as noun phrases, verb phrases, adverbial phrases, or prepositional phrases, depending on how they act in the sentence. So, what's a clause? Well, a clause is different from a phrase because it contains both a subject and a verb. So a clause will be made up of individual phrases. And clauses themselves are the building blocks of sentences. So a sentence can consist in a single clause, i.e. a subject and a verb alone, or a combination of clauses combined by what are called conjunctions. And we can classify clauses in different ways. One way is by whether they can stand independently or not. An independent clause, sometimes called a main or a finite clause, can stand alone as a sentence in its own right. And you've guessed it, a dependent clause, which is also sometimes called a subordinate clause, only makes sense when it's joined to an independent clause. So in our two examples here we can see Jane talks slowly at the library. Jane talks slowly makes sense as a sentence in its own right. Whereas I had food before I left, the clause before I left doesn't make sense on its own. We'll always be left asking the question, what before you left? Now, subordinate clauses can also be classed by how they function. So, an adverbial clause provides more information about where, when, or in which manner an action took place. Whereas a relative clause, also sometimes called an adjective clause, provides more information about either the subject or object of the sentence, often identifying who or what we're talking about. The term adjective is used because they qualify another noun. Finally, a noun clause is so called because it acts as a noun in the sentence. In this example, I know where she is hiding. The clause where she is hiding acts as the object of the verb to know. It is the thing which is known. Here, in these examples, we can see that pronouns which begin with the letter w can begin both a relative clause or a noun clause. Technically, a pronoun is only a relative pronoun if it is beginning a relative clause, and so the where in a noun clause technically isn't a relative pronoun. However, it's quite common for people to call the pronoun a relative pronoun in both these types of clauses. Well now, a major difference between a clause and a phrase, besides the fact that a clause has a subject and a verb, is that a clause can often be moved around without changing the meaning of the sentence. So if we take the example, the lights were on when you woke up. When you woke up is the subordinate clause to the main clause, the lights were on. But equally, in terms of meaning, if we were to reverse the two clauses, when you woke up, the lights were on, this actually has no impact on the meaning of the sentence. Whether the subordinate clause comes before or after the main clause has no impact on the meaning of the sentence. And in English, the subordinate clause can also sometimes be embedded inside the main clause. The lights, when you woke up, were on. Now, a relative clause is qualifying a noun that precedes it somewhere, and so sometimes the relative clause can be at the end of the sentence. The man was happy who visited. Or embedded in the main clause. The man who visited was happy. However, because it has to follow a noun, relative clauses in English cannot appear before their main clause. Well, that's a brief look at clauses in general, and we've learnt two things about relative clauses, and that is, they must begin with a relative pronoun, and they can either follow the main clause, or more usually in English, they are embedded inside the main clause. So now I think it would be useful to look at the anatomy of relative clauses in the English language in more detail. The first thing to notice is that the clauses actually express two separate thoughts, which are linked by a common thing. So if we take the example, the man stole a book and he visited yesterday, we can see the subjects of both sentences refer to the same thing. the man. So it is this noun phrase, the man, that a relative clause will modify. So to embed the second clause, first we have to change the subject to a relative pronoun, and we will use the pronoun who because it refers to a person, and then position it in the sentence immediately after the thing that it modifies. And also, sometimes in English, we can add a second pronoun in the main clause to finish the sentence. This second pronoun is termed the correlative pronoun. The word relative is actually from Latin and means to refer back. And here both the relative pronoun of the subordinate clause and the correlative pronoun both refer back to the man. And the noun to which they both refer is termed the antecedent noun. Antecedent, in fact, literally means goes before. And so we get the man who visited yesterday, he stole a book. One final thing to say is that in English, the correlative pronoun isn't always included. In fact, we can miss it out and the sentence still makes sense. The man who visited yesterday stole a book. So now we come to looking at relative clauses in the Pali language. And in Pali, things are a little different. The main difference being that the subordinate clause nearly always comes before the main clause. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and order of clauses can be reversed to add emphasis. But for now, we're just going to keep things simple. Now, like English, a subordinate clause will begin with a relative pronoun or relative adverb. And in Pali, relative terms are formed on the stem ya. In English, relative pronouns have a similar form to interrogative pronouns, who, where and when, etc. But in Pali, relative terms are on a separate stem. Interrogative pronouns are formed on ka, whereas relative pronouns are formed on ya. And the main clause usually also begins with a correlative pronoun, which will be formed on the stem ta. And so we can use the presence of these pronouns to identify where one clause ends and the next clause starts. So let's now take a quick look at how pronouns on the stem ya decline. Well, hopefully by now it'll be no surprise to find that the pronoun declines in the three genders, and it also declines in a similar way to pronouns on the stem ta. I don't want to get too hung up on declensions, as these can always be looked up. I think it's more important to understand how pronouns operate in sentences. So let's look at some examples. Yo Raja Nipajati Tang Pachanti. The first thing we must do is identify the subordinate clause and the main clause. And we can do this because we know the relative clause will start with a ya stem pronoun and the main clause will start with a ta stem pronoun. Next, we need to identify the antecedent noun, and there are two rules which help us do this. First, if the antecedent is actually expressed in the sentence, it will be placed in the relative clause. And the second rule is that both the relative pronoun and the correlative pronoun will agree with this antecedent noun in both gender and number. So we must look for a noun in the relative clause which matches the pronouns in gender and number, and here we can see that it's the king. Now sometimes, when deciphering relative clauses, it's easier to separate the two clauses out into two separate sentences. And it's important to realise that the pronouns in each clause take their case based on the function that the antecedent plays in that clause. So if we take the main clause first, we can see that the case of the correlative pronoun tang is accusative, and the verb pachanti is a plural third-person verb, meaning they ask. So the main clause will read, they ask the king, while in the relative clause, the relative pronoun yo and the king are both in nominative case, and they will be the subject of the third-person verb sleeps. So the relative clause reads, the king who sleeps. And of course, placing these two clauses together, we get, they ask the king who sleeps. Now, I'm going quite slowly, as this process can be a little bit baffling at first, and looking at some more examples will hopefully help. Okay, so first let's separate the relative and the main clause. Now if we look at the pronouns, they're both in singular masculine, and there's a singular masculine noun in the relative clause, so that's likely to be the antecedent. And if we now take the main clause, we can see that the pronoun so is in nominative case, and that the verb is a third-person singular verb which matches that pronoun, and so we can assume that the man is the subject of the verb. So we can write out the main clause as, the man is called Jyotipala. But in the relative clause, both the relative pronoun and the antecedent noun are in accusative case, which means they will be the object of their verb. And the verb is in first-person singular, meaning I saw. So the relative clause is the man who I saw. And so altogether, the man who I saw, he is called Jyotipala. Another important thing to note with relative clauses is that the antecedent doesn't always appear in the relative clause. And in this case, we take the correlative pronoun as the antecedent. Okay, now in this example, if we separate the relative and the main clauses, we can see that the pronouns ye and te are in the plural masculine, and there isn't a matching noun in the relative clause. So in this case, we have to take the pronoun te as the antecedent noun itself. And it's in nominative case, being the subject of the third-person plural verb. So we can construct the main clause as, they do not lament. And now if we look at the relative clause, the verb pasanti is in third-person plural, matching the pronoun who, and the noun, the Blessed One, is in accusative case, being the object of this verb. So we can render the relative clause, they who see the Blessed One. And together, they who see the Blessed One do not lament. And again, let's first identify the relative clause and the main clause, and then looking at the two pronouns, we can see they're in singular masculine, and this time there is a matching noun in the relative clause, but it's in accusative case and will be the object of the verb pasati, he sees. So we may have to try deciphering this in a couple of different ways to see which works. But because the relative pronoun doesn't match the subject, we'll first take the correlative pronoun as being the antecedent. So looking at the main clause, we can say, he sees the Dharma, and the relative clause will be, he who sees the Buddha. And so together, he who sees the Buddha, he sees the Dharma. And in this final example, if we separate out the relative and the main clauses, and then look at the pronouns, we can see that the relative pronoun, yasa, and the correlative, sa, are both singular female, and there isn't a matching singular female noun in the relative clause, so we must take the correlative pronoun, sa, as the antecedent noun. And if we now look at the main clause, we can see that it's made of nouns in the nominative case with the verb is, and the word punyavati is actually an adjective qualifying mata, mother. So we can render the main clause as an equational sentence: she is a fortunate mother. And if we now turn to the relative clause, again we can see that the pronoun and the noun are in nominative case, with a linking verb, hoti, which could be rendered, he is a son. But as the relative pronoun is in genitive case, the relative clause is a property or quality of the antecedent, she. So this will read, she whose son is he. Or more correctly, she whose son he is a fortunate mother. Well, this has been a long tutorial, and there's a lot of information to digest. So let's go over some of the main points again. A phrase is a group of words forming a unit and usually acting as a single part of speech, i.e., as a noun, a verb, or a preposition. Whereas a clause is actually a mini-sentence. They contain both a subject and a verb, and they can be classified as being either independent, meaning that they can stand alone as a sentence, and these are often called main or finite clauses too, or they are dependent, meaning that they require a main clause in order to make sense. A relative clause is one type of subordinate clause, and these clauses add more information about a preceding noun, also called the antecedent noun. They often define or identify the specific thing being talked about. And the relative pronoun, which begins a relative clause, refers back to this antecedent noun. The term relative actually means to refer back, and antecedent means goes before. When we consider relative clauses in the Pali language, we can see that the subordinate clause usually comes before its main clause. The relative clause will begin with a relative pronoun or adverb formed on the stem ya, whereas the main clause is usually marked by a correlative pronoun made from the stem ta. The important things to remember are that the antecedent, if it is a substantive noun, will be placed in the relative clause, but if it's a pronoun, it will act as the correlative term. Also, both the relative and correlative pronouns will agree with the antecedent noun in both gender and number, whereas their case is defined by the function that the antecedent is playing in the two clauses. So we can use these rules first to identify the two clauses and then to identify the antecedent. The two clauses can then be rendered separately, as they will act like mini-sentences in their own right, before we finally bring them back to form an English relative sentence. Well, this isn't the end of relative clauses in the Pali language, and in the next video we'll look at some more types. And finally, if you'd like more information, please check out my other videos and playlists on my YouTube channel, or visit my blog